And then there's this theory, widely debunked. This paper from 2 Chinese researchers that says it is plausible that the virus leaked accidentally from one of 2 labs near the Wuhan seafood market.
Coronavirus was man-made in a lab in Wuhan, China. And yet this week, Donald Trump is still pushing the debunked bunkum, despite his own intelligence community's findings that is simply not true.
The Wuhan lab, we know that it's been debunked that this virus was man-made or modified or anything like that.
Those same agencies now have been tapped with investigating one of Trump world's most favorite conspiracy theories.
Tom Cotton, one of Donald Trump's staunchest allies in the Senate, suggested that the virus might have originated in a high-security biochemical lab in China. In the 1980s, I remember when the far left trafficked in rumors about HIV having been invented in CIA labs. The far right has now found its own virus conspiracy theory.
Yes, the far right. Joining me now, investigative reporter, co-host of The War Room, Natalie Winters. Natalie, okay, so the CIA admitting that COVID came from a Chinese lab. Okay, we got all that, but one thing I've found fascinating this entire time is why cover it up at all? What difference does it make to me, an American, if it came from a bowl of bat soup or it came from a lab in Wuhan? But very clearly the system wanted me to believe it was the bowl of bat soup. Why?
Yeah, it's certainly an Achilles heel. And I think that how you answer that question, there's sort of an interesting, whether you want to call it a limited hangout or sort of a reframe in terms of the idea of who is responsible for covering up the true origins of COVID-19. Because right now, everyone in the mainstream media class is quick to say, well, it was the Chinese Communist Party. It was the World Health Organization. But in reality, their Western counterparts, Western elites, are equally to blame, if not, I would argue, almost more so, right? Western media outlets were as bad, if not worse, than Chinese state-run communist propaganda outlets in terms of covering up, like that montage that you just played. And I think, the question is, right, sort of cui bono, right? Who benefits from running cover for the Chinese Communist Party? And you're talking about the corporations who've been in business with them for so long, politicians whose career rises have been inextricably linked to that of the Chinese Communist Party. They've been on the receiving ends of campaign cash and, weird blackmail schemes, look no further than Hunter Biden. But that's because I think the unfortunate truth, to go very, meta here, is that the entire world economic kind of system and order that we run on rests upon the Chinese Communist Party staying in power. And the original sin of that economic model is that the Chinese people are essentially slave laborers. And if you were to give the Chinese Communist Party, I think, a nice reflection in the mirror of what they did with COVID-19, what they've subjected their own people to, let alone the whole world, not only would you see, I think, internal discontent and strife, like you saw, I think, a little whimper of, at least before the Western press came in and quashed it, at least domestically in China, but these corporations, these people would be forced to answer for their decades of collaborationist sentiment and just straight up collaboration with the enemy that I think it's never been clearer than what they did with COVID-19.
Explain to me the media perspective as it pertains to China. It's not difficult to figure out why some filthy Chi-Com would want to cover up that it came from a lab. It's not difficult to figure out why a CEO who set up his factory in, Shanghai would want to say it came from a bowl of bat soup. But the anchor at CNN, he's got 5 viewers. Why wouldn't he just come out and say what we really all kind of knew to begin with? What does it bother him?
Well, the chapter and verse answer to your question is that the Chinese Communist Party has been running sophisticated, very targeted media infiltration and warfare campaigns against Western journalists for a very, very long time. They have something called the United Front Work Department, which is a multi-billion-dollar political warfare operation that emanates out of Beijing. It's closely run by the Chinese Communist Party, and it's sort of the apparatus, the element that they use to target not just Western journalists, but academics and think tankers and politicians, and of course their kin and their next of kin. And in the case of media, they obviously know that controlling public opinion is very, very important, especially at home, but also even more importantly abroad here in the United States. So they have a myriad of tactics that they use, but one of their preferred tactics is basically paying Western journalists to come overseas, so to go and visit China on subsidized trips. So the Chinese Communist Party or groups that are very innocuously named, like the China United United States Exchange Foundation will subsidize these trips. They tour not just military facilities, they tour Huawei. They basically get propaganda to the max. From legitimate de facto elements of de jure elements of the Chinese Communist Party. But I had broke this story 2-3 years ago through the Foreign Agent Registration Act filings. And the most interesting part is that not only did they admit to seeking out journalists that they thought would provide them, quote, favorable coverage, but that upon return, they had to, quote, disseminate positive messages about the Chinese Communist Party and their sort of rise in this neoliberal world order. And this isn't just some niche journalists that they were picking. It was the Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, people like Matthew Iglesias, a lot of these, bigwig lefty journalist types who were involved in this very explicit pay-for-play journalism type scheme that's actual foreign interference and foreign collusion. If you want to take the lefts, I guess, do some cultural appropriation. But that's sort of, I think, just one anecdote. But that's why you see the coverage that you do, because it's full-scale political warfare.
I'm so jealous. I mean, the Chi-Coms hate me, so I'm never going to be able to go over there. But I want to I want to see the Great Wall of China, and I can't ever go into that country or I'll be arrested. But that would be freaking sweet. Okay, so Trump, as it relates to China, did not exactly end on a positive note with that country. Everyone knows he's always talking about China. Where are they now?
Well, look, President Trump was very clairvoyant. He actually sanctioned, basically put into oblivion, a lot of these United Front Work Department groups that were targeting local level officials, governors, state level officials. They were making a hardcore press when it came to agricultural officials across this country, too. Look, I think when President Trump invited Xi Jinping, for, I think, scholars and people who pay attention to the inauguration, for people who pay attention to Chinese history, they are very obsessed with the concept of, right, the Thucydides trap, the idea that the Chinese Communist Party is sort of on the ascent and will replace the United States, not in a multipolar world order, but in a new unipolar world order where they become the new global hegemon. And they love the idea of sort of foreign countries having to be supplicants and coming and sort of, for lack of a better word, kowtowing to Chinese Communist Party leaders, to Chinese Communist Party run businesses. So I think it was sort of an epic troll when President Trump did invite Xi Jinping to the inauguration. And I think you've sort of seen that legacy continue. But much like I think that montage that you just played showing how they framed the origins of COVID as, the racist and, nativist elements of the far right, like myself and yourself included, were wrong on COVID. I think this whole framing now of the tariffs, the trade war, and all that is something that's sort of akin to that. What do I mean by that? The trade war has been waged against the United States by the Chinese Communist Party since their ascension into the World Trade Organization, right? They have been crippling our economy, our various industries with intellectual property theft, you name it, a myriad of economic warfare tactics that's codified into their military doctrine. We're finally now just punching back. And I think you can tell that the tariffs are something that really, really freak them out because they've been sort of melting down about them. I hope President Trump, sticks to his guns and actually institutes them. But I think that people should really pay attention to the way that the mainstream media covers it, because anybody who uses the term trade war and thinks that Donald Trump is the aggressor when it comes to China is so woefully mistaken, not just on the lived economic reality of Americans, but just basic financial and economic metrics that you can see how the Chinese Communist Party has been abusing this country and our economy for so long.
Natalie, the H-1B visas got into the news recently, and of course we were told that we must have all these people here because us stupid Americans have the gall to play sports and talk to girls. But of course, it's just a system that is used to abuse the American worker. The Chinese have been doing this, haven't they?
Of course, I think you left out that we're too busy having sleepovers as well. No sleepovers in the Kelly household.
Yes,
no, the H-1B issue is so interesting. I think if you put it through the lens, it's so easy for us to think of big pharma lobbyists, right, or big tobacco, whoever, the way that they lie to us only to boost profits of a certain industry, right? That's sort of the MO of the whole lobbying apparatus. The H-1B debacle is quite literally no different than Pfizer lobbyists or Moderna lobbyists wanting to get vaccine mandates implemented so they can have better profit margins. What do I mean by that? The data to create the narrative that Americans need to import people who come from backwards third world countries where they're woefully underperforming and less skilled than the average American worker, that the reason why we need to import them is because A, there's the best and the brightest. I'm sure everyone's heard that lovely alliterative phrase, and that we have a shortage of workers here. So we need to therefore bring in the best and the brightest. Those two sort of compounding factors that create this lie that then necessitates the mass importation of H-1B visa holders is rooted in completely BS and bogus science. Even the Government Accountability Office, when they actually went into the National Science Foundation, the original report that was sort of the footnote for any time anyone would ever make these claims, they even admitted that the data was never there. It looks like they more or less made it up. The overwhelming majority of H-1B visa holders that they're importing, I'm talking like upwards of 80%, make less than the average salary of a tech worker, because over 80% of them are actually in the bottom 1% in terms of skills. They're not the, best and brightest category of the top of the H-1B stuff, which anyways would be the O-1B visa category, which is its kind of own category to begin with. So the H-1B stuff, like I'm sure people have seen the screenshots online, they're not glamorous jobs. They're not people who are necessarily making this country better. They like to, tout statistics saying that every H-1B that you bring in creates X or amount of jobs for American citizens. It's not true. And on the opposite side of the coin, when you look at the numbers of Americans, not just who are unemployed, but particularly Americans with STEM degrees who will never work in STEM, you're talking about 1 in 2 American STEM graduates who, despite graduating from an accredited United States-based institution and actually can speak English, unlike half of these H-1B people, will never work in STEM because their job is going to be outsourced to someone from likely India or China. And by the way, Jesse, just to, I think, really make this whole debate even more just absurd, the same people who are telling us that we need to import the quote best and brightest so we can be competitive with the Chinese Communist Party are advocating for a visa program where the second largest beneficiary and recipient of importing people from a certain country under this visa category, the H-1B, is none other than China. A country that, per Article 7 of their national intelligence law, stipulates that any Chinese citizen can be weaponized against the United States at any moment for any purpose and at any time. Gee, I wonder why the United States is getting hacked so much and why intellectual property theft is off the charts. Because we're quite literally importing the enemy into our country just so we can suppress wages of Americans and make these evil America-hating corporations better profit margins.
I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.